My name is Robert Vance. I am 68 years old, and my hands shake. It's not a tremor born of fear or weakness, but a condition I've learned to live with. My daughter-in-law, Chloe, used those shaking hands as a weapon. At our Christmas gathering in front of everyone, she held up the leather-bound journal I had spent 100 hours crafting for her, and called it cheap amateur work. My son, her husband, said nothing. What Chloe didn't know is that those same unsteady hands had architected the anonymous $400,000 trust fund paying for her prestigious medical degree. She believed the money came from a faceless family foundation, a gift from the universe. She didn't know the universe had a name. And she didn't know that universe was about to make one single phone call that would tear her perfectly curated world apart. Before I tell you how a simple, cruel comment unraveled a legacy, let me know in the comments where you are listening from in the world. And please hit that like and subscribe button if you have ever had to teach someone the true meaning of value. The air in my son Michael's house was thick with the smell of pine and simmering resentment. On the surface, everything was perfect, too perfect. The minimalist cathedral of glass and steel they called a home was decorated with the designer's touch, all stark whites and cold metallics. It felt less like a home and more like a showroom, a place where life was staged, not lived. Chloe was holding court by the fireplace, a glass of champagne in one hand, gesturing with the other to show off a new blood-red designer bag. Her friends, all cast from the same mold of casual wealth, laughed at something she said. Michael, my son, was a ghost in his own home, moving through the crowd to refill glasses, his smile as thin as the expensive crystal he was holding. He caught my eye for a moment, then quickly looked away. It was a dance we had been doing for years. I waited for a lull in the performance before I approached Chloe. I was holding a simple, elegantly wrapped box. "Merry Christmas, Chloe," I said, my voice sounding warmer than I felt. She turned, her smile practiced and bright. "Bob, you made it." She never called me Dad. She took the box, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the paper. Inside was the journal. The leather was a rich, dark brown, and I had spent weeks tooling the cover with the rod of Asclepius, the symbol of medicine entwined with a delicate wreath of lilies, which had been my late wife Diane's favorite flower. The tremor in my hands, a constant companion since my late 50s, had made every cut and stitch an act of defiance. Some of the lines weren't perfectly straight. A discerning eye could see the human flaw in the work, but it was made with a love that should have been flawless. Chloe's smile faltered as she lifted it from the box. It was for only a second, but I saw it. The mask of politeness slipped, revealing a flicker of raw disappointment. This wasn't designer. It didn't come with a famous logo. It was just something old, something made. She ran a single finger over the tooled leather, then glanced at my hands, which were trembling slightly from the cold and the nerves. She held it up for her friends to see, a small theatrical gesture. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet condescension. "It's quaint. A little piece of cheap amateur work to remember you by." The words hung in the air, sharp and glittering as shattered glass. A few of her friends shifted uncomfortably. One of them suddenly found the ceiling intensely interesting. Chloe, oblivious or perhaps enjoying the discomfort, placed the journal on the marble coffee table. She set it down next to a stack of glossy fashion magazines, where it already looked like an artifact from another lesser world. I looked across the room at Michael. I searched his face for any sign of protest, any spark of loyalty to the father who had raised him. There was nothing. He just stared at his perfectly polished hardwood floors, as if they held the secrets of the universe. His silence was a verdict. It told me everything I needed to know. The insult from Chloe was a wound, but my own son's silence was the salt poured into it. I stayed for another 20 minutes, making polite conversation that felt like chewing on sand. Then I made my excuses and left the forced chorus of Merry Christmas following me out into the cold night air. The engine of my old Buick was the only sound as I drove through the silent, snow-dusted streets. The anger I expected to feel never came. In its place was just a deep, hollow ache, the kind that settles in your bones and reminds you of all the empty spaces in your life. Diane had been gone for 5 years. The silence in the car, in my house, in my life was a constant presence. After she passed, I thought I would fall apart. The grief was a physical weight, and the tremor in my hands grew worse. My doctor said it was just my nerves, a condition called essential tremor, but it felt like my body was betraying me just as life had. I needed something to fight back with, something to focus on. That's when I found leatherworking. I bought old tools online and watched hours of videos. My first few projects were clumsy and uneven, but I kept at it. The intense focus required to cut a straight line, to punch a clean hole, to pull a stitch tight. It calmed the shaking. It quieted the noise in my head. Each finished piece, no matter how small, was a victory. It was a way of proving to myself that these hands could still create something beautiful, something whole. Diane had adored Chloe. She saw in her not just a daughter-in-law, but the daughter she never had. When Chloe was accepted into medical school, Diane was ecstatic. A healer in the family. Bob, she had said, her eyes shining. There's no nobler calling. It was Diane's dream to see her become a doctor. After Diane was gone, honoring that dream became my mission. The journal wasn't just a gift. It was a tribute. It was a testament to Diane's faith in her. And tonight, Chloe hadn't just insulted a handmade object. She had desecrated a memory. I pulled into my driveway and killed the engine. The house was dark. For the first time, the emptiness didn't feel like grief. It felt like clarity. A cold, hard, and absolute clarity. The architect in my mind, the part of me that designs and builds, began to stir. It was time to review the blueprints of my life and make a few structural changes. The sun rose on Christmas morning, but it brought no warmth. It only served to illuminate the dust motes dancing in the silent air of my empty house. I sat at my small kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee that tasted like ash. Outside, a fresh blanket of snow had covered the world in a pristine, unforgiving white. It was beautiful in a way that felt like a mockery. Last night's party played over and over in my mind, a film loop of cold smiles and colder words. Chloe's voice sharp and dismissive. Michael's silence a gaping void where a son's loyalty should have been. I tried to push it away, to tell myself it was just one bad moment, a slip of the tongue fueled by holiday stress and too much champagne. But I knew better. It wasn't a moment. It was a revelation. It was the curtain being pulled back to show the ugly, corroded machinery that had been running our family for years. I traced the rim of my coffee mug, a simple ceramic thing Diane had bought at a local craft fair years ago. Its handle was chipped, its glaze faded, but it felt more real and valuable in my hands than anything in that sterile mansion of theirs. I thought about the journal probably still sitting on that marble table, an unwanted orphan among the glossy tributes to consumerism. I wondered if they had thrown it away yet. The thought sent a surprisingly sharp pang through my chest. It wasn't about the object itself. It was about the hours, the effort, the love that had been poured into it, only to be deemed worthless. When my phone buzzed on the tabletop, the sound was an intrusion, a violation of the quiet ache I was tending to. I saw Michael's name on the screen. For a foolish, fragile second, my heart leaped. A pathetic, hopeful little flutter. This is it, I thought. He's calling to apologize. He woke up this morning, realized how terrible last night was, and he's calling to make it right. He's going to say he's sorry for not standing up for me, that Chloe didn't mean it, that they love me. I let it ring a second time, then a third, savoring that sliver of hope, wanting it to be true so badly I could almost taste it. Then I finally answered, schooling my voice to sound neutral. Hello, Michael. There was a burst of noise on the other end, the clatter of plates and distant cheerful music. They were having their perfect Christmas morning. "Dad," he said, his voice rushed, distracted. "Hey, listen, I can't talk long. We're about to open presents with Chloe's family. I just had a quick question." The hope in my chest shriveled and died, turning into a cold, heavy stone. There was no apology coming. There was no acknowledgement of what had happened. It was as if the entire humiliating episode had been erased from his memory, deemed too insignificant to even register. "A question," I repeated, my own voice sounding distant to my ears. "What is it?" I could hear Chloe in the background, her voice a high, demanding murmur. Michael spoke again, his tone that of someone trying to complete a mildly annoying errand. "Yeah, so Chloe needs to sign some paperwork for the next tuition payment from Mom's fund. She says there's a form that needs a trustee's signature or something. Do you know what the procedure is now? Does she just send it to the bank, or does it have to go through you first?" And there it was. The final killing blow. It wasn't an insult shouted in public. It was a quiet, bureaucratic inquiry that revealed the absolute truth of my position in their lives. I was not a father. I was not family. I was a functionary, an administrator for an account they felt entitled to. He called it Mom's Fund, as if Diane herself were writing the checks from beyond the grave, and I was merely the inconvenient clerk who handled the earthly details. They had taken her beautiful, heartfelt dream of supporting a healer and turned it into a line item in their budget. They had transformed her legacy into an ATM, and I was the man who held the PIN code. The cold stone in my chest solidified, hardening into something that felt like steel. The hurt was still there, but it was now encased in a layer of ice. All the warmth I had ever felt for them, all the excuses I had made for their behavior over the years, it all vanished in that moment. I saw them with a brutal, unforgiving clarity. They were not my family in any way that mattered. They were tenants living in a house I had built, eating food from a table I had set, and it was long past time to deliver the eviction notice. I looked out the window at the perfect, unblemished snow. I thought of the new scholarship I had read about last month for underprivileged students entering the medical field at the state university. Students who had to fight for everything they had, who would see a gift not as their due but as a miracle. My voice, when I finally spoke, was calm. It was so calm it frightened me. "I'm not sure, Michael," I said, the words clear and precise. "Things may have changed. You should have her check with the financial aid office at her school. They'll have the most up-to-date information." Before he could ask another question, before he could process the chill in my tone, I ended the call. I set the phone down on the table face down. The decision was no longer a thought or a feeling. It was a fact. It had settled into the foundation of my world. The architect was done reviewing the blueprints. It was time to begin the demolition. A few hours passed in that same heavy silence. I didn't move from the kitchen table. The coffee went cold. The sun climbed higher in the sky, but the house remained shadowed, filled with the ghosts of a family that used to be. I was suspended in a state of grim acceptance, the cold reality of the morning's phone call settling over me. It was one thing to be insulted in person, to be dismissed over the phone. But that was a private pain, a family wound, to be nursed in the dark. I thought that was the end of it. I thought the cruelty had reached its peak. I was wrong. The ping from my phone was sharp this time. It wasn't Michael. It was a message from George, my oldest friend, a man I had shared a drafting table with for 30 years at the architecture firm. The message was simple, and that's how I knew it was serious. It just said, "Bob, I saw this. Call me if you need anything." Beneath the text was a screenshot from Instagram. My heart, which I thought had already turned to stone, somehow managed to sink even lower. The photo was a carefully staged tableau of Chloe's Christmas presents arranged on her pristine white sofa like a magazine spread. There was the blood-red designer bag from the party, a sleek new laptop in a silver box, a delicate diamond necklace sparkling on a velvet stand. It was a monument to materialism, a shrine to everything expensive and new. And there, in the bottom right corner of the frame, was my journal. It was partially obscured, pushed to the side as if it were clutter. Worse, Chloe had used it as a coaster. A half-empty flute of champagne was resting directly on the hand-tooled leather, leaving a wet ring on the Asclepius symbol I had spent so many painstaking hours on. But the image, as insulting as it was nothing compared to the caption written below it. Her words were a masterclass in passive aggression, designed to look cheerful while delivering a payload of contempt. It read, "Feeling so blessed this Christmas, surrounded by so much love and generosity from my amazing family. A truly wonderful haul. You just have to filter out some of the well-meaning but tacky handmade gifts, you know." A winking emoji followed the sentence. Then a string of hashtags: blessed Christmas haul, family goals, med school life. I stared at the screen, the words blurring in front of my eyes. Tacky. She had called my gift tacky. She had taken my effort, my love, my tribute to Diane's memory, and held it up for her hundreds of followers to mock. This wasn't just an insult anymore. This was a public execution of my worth. She wasn't just ungrateful. She was actively cruel, using my gesture of love as a punchline to elevate her own status. She had taken a private family moment and broadcast it to the world as a joke at my expense. The ice that had formed around my heart after Michael's call began to crack, but not to melt. It fractured to reveal the granite underneath. There was no more pain. There was no more sadness. There was only a profound, silent, and unshakable resolve. This was no longer about a single comment or a thoughtless son. This was about a fundamental lack of character, a deficit of decency so profound it couldn't be ignored or forgiven. The Diane Vance Educational Trust was founded on the principle of supporting a healer, someone with compassion and integrity. Chloe had just proven in the most public way imaginable that she possessed neither. She was not worthy of Diane's dream. She was not worthy of another dollar. I slowly pushed my chair back from the table. The sound scraped loudly in the quiet house. I stood up, my movements deliberate, no longer weighed down by grief, but fueled by a cold, clear purpose. I left the phone on the table, the glowing screen a testament to her betrayal. I walked out of the kitchen, down the familiar hallway, and into my home office. The room was neat, orderly, a space of logic and plans. I sat down in my old leather chair, the one that had supported me through countless projects and plans. I reached for the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized binder. The label on the spine was written in my own steady hand. It read simply, "The Diane Vance Trust." The silence was no longer a void. It was the calm before a perfectly engineered storm. My office has always been my sanctuary. It is a room of order, logic, and quiet contemplation. The walls are lined with bookshelves filled not just with books on architecture and design, but with the novels Diane used to love. The air smells of old paper and wood polish. In here, the chaotic emotions of the last 24 hours seemed to fade, replaced by the calm precision that had defined my career. I walked over to the built-in bookshelf that covered the far wall and ran my hand along a row of leather-bound classics. My fingers found the hidden latch disguised as a book spine, and a section of the shelf swung inward, revealing the dark gray steel of a wall safe. I spun the combination lock, the familiar clicks echoing in the silent room. The heavy door swung open. Inside, next to a few important documents and a small box of Diane's jewelry, was a thick 3-ring binder. I lifted it out. It was heavy-weighted with the history of a life's dream. The plastic label on the spine was written in my own block lettering, neat and precise, "The Diane Vance Educational Trust." I carried it over to my large wooden desk, the one I had designed myself decades ago, and sat down. For a moment, I just rested my hands on the cover. This binder wasn't just a collection of financial statements and legal documents. It was the story of my marriage. It was the final chapter of my love for Diane. I opened it. The first page was a simple savings account statement from over 30 years ago. The initial deposit was for $50. I remembered that day perfectly. I was a junior architect making just enough to get by. Diane was a librarian at the city library, a job she adored. We didn't have much, but we had a shared belief in the power of education. That $50 was the first seed we planted, a promise to the future, to the children we hoped to have. Flipping through the early pages was like walking through the past. Each deposit slip, each bank statement told a story. There was the small inheritance Diane received when her grandmother passed, which went straight into the account. There were the years we brown-bagged our lunches and skipped vacations, adding a little more each month. We called it our dream fund. We didn't know exactly what the dream was yet, only that it would be for the next generation. We wanted to give our family a head start, a foundation that we never had. After Diane got sick, the fund took on a new urgency. And after she was gone, it became my obsession. It was the last project we had started together, and I was determined to see it through. With Diane gone, I took the architect's mind that had designed buildings and applied it to our savings. I plunged into the world of investing. I spent hundreds of hours in this very office reading financial reports, studying market trends, and teaching myself the language of Wall Street. It was never a gamble. It was a design project. I built a diversified portfolio weathering the dot-com bust and the 2008 financial crisis with careful, calculated moves. I treated our nest egg like a structure that needed to be built with a solid foundation, able to withstand any storm. And it grew. The modest savings of a librarian and an architect slowly, steadily blossomed into a small fortune. When Chloe came into Michael's life and announced her dream of becoming a doctor, it felt like a sign. It was the perfect purpose for the fund. It was the fulfillment of Diane's legacy. I met with my friend David Chen, my financial advisor, and we structured the trust. I insisted on one thing: it had to be anonymous. I didn't want Chloe to feel beholden to me. I didn't want our relationship to be transactional. I wanted her to see this as an opportunity, a gift from the universe, so that she could focus solely on her studies without the weight of personal obligation. David had advised against it, saying it could create distance, but I was adamant. I thought it was the purest way to give the gift. Chloe and Michael were told that the money came from a professionally managed family foundation set up years ago, a vague explanation they accepted without question. They never asked for the details. They just accepted the checks. I kept flipping through the pages, past the stock performance charts, past the quarterly reports. I finally reached the last section, the legal framework of the trust itself. The dense pages of legalese were familiar to me. I had read them a dozen times. My finger traced the lines until I found the section I was looking for. Article 9, Section 4. It was a special clause, one that David had called highly unusual. He had tried to talk me out of it, but I had insisted. It was the one part of this financial structure that was not about money, but about character. I read the words, my own insistence from years ago, echoing back to me with the force of prophecy. The benefactor reserves the full and indisputable right to redirect or rescind all future funding if the designated beneficiary fails to demonstrate and maintain the core values of compassion, integrity, and respect for human dignity. These qualities are deemed fundamental to the practice of medicine and the spirit in which this trust was founded. This determination rests solely with the benefactor or their appointed executor. I remembered the day I signed the document. I had thought of Diane. She believed that a doctor without compassion was just a skilled mechanic fixing bodies without healing people. This clause was my promise to her. It was a firewall to protect her dream from being corrupted. I was not just funding a degree. I was investing in a person, in a set of values. And in the space of 24 hours, Chloe had taken those values and set them on fire. I closed the binder. There was no hesitation left in me, no doubt. The memories hadn't softened my resolve. They had forged it into steel. This wasn't revenge. This was a course correction. It was my duty as the architect of this fund and the guardian of my wife's legacy. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for David Chen's office. It was time to bring in the contractor. David Chen's office was on the 12th floor of a modest downtown building overlooking the city park. It was a space that valued function over fashion. The furniture was comfortable but not ostentatious, the walls lined with framed architectural blueprints I had given him over the years, mixed with photos of his own family. It was the office of a man who dealt in realities, not appearances. It was a place where truth felt welcome. David greeted me not with a handshake, but with a concerned look and 2 cups of black coffee. He was a sharp, meticulous man, with kind eyes, a friend who had helped me navigate the financial complexities after Diane's death. More than that, he had known Diane. He had been to our home for barbecues. He understood the foundation upon which my life had been built. We sat in the 2 worn leather chairs facing his large oak desk. For a moment, we just sipped our coffee in silence. He didn't press me. He waited. That was David's way. He was a listener, a man who gathered all the facts before forming a judgment. Finally, I placed the thick binder on his desk. The sound was a heavy, definitive thud. "I need to make a change to the Diane Vance Trust," I said, my voice even. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "I assumed as much when you called," he said. "What's happened, Bob, and I didn't let my anger or hurt color the story. I presented the facts as an architect would present a structural analysis, pointing out the flaws and stress points in a failing design. I told him about the Christmas party, about the journal. I repeated Chloe's words, cheap amateur work, letting them hang in the quiet air of his office. I told him about Michael's silence, a foundational support beam that had simply crumbled. I told him about the phone call on Christmas morning, the casual, unthinking dismissal of my existence beyond my function as a financial administrator. And then I took out my phone. I opened the picture George had sent me and slid it across the polished surface of the desk. David picked up the phone. He didn't need his reading glasses to see it. I watched his expression change. The professional concern in his eyes hardened into something else. It was a quiet, profound disappointment. He zoomed in on the champagne flute resting on my journal, on the wet ring it was leaving behind. He read the caption, his lips tightening into a thin line. He was a man who understood numbers, but he also understood value. He knew the difference between a price tag and a thing's true worth. He placed the phone back on the desk gently. "I see," he said. The 2 words were heavy with meaning. He understood completely. "I want to activate Article 9, Section 4, I stated, tapping the binder. "The clause we talked about. I want to pull the funding, all of it, effective immediately." David leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the binder. He didn't argue. He didn't tell me to calm down or to think it over. He had seen the evidence. He simply nodded again. "I remember the day you insisted on that clause," he said, a note of grim respect in his voice. "I thought you were being overly cautious. I thought you were preparing for a storm that would never come." He leaned forward, opening the binder and turning directly to the legal section. "You were wise to put this in, Bob. It's ironclad. Your language was precise. The power to make this determination rests solely with you." He turned to his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. A series of charts and numbers appeared on the large monitor facing me. "Let's look at the current state of the trust," he said, his voice shifting into a professional tone. The numbers were stark. The trust's total value was just over $600,000. "We've disbursed $198,000 over the last 3 years to cover her tuition and living expenses," David explained, pointing to a line on the screen. "That leaves a remaining balance of $402,000. He let the number hang in the air. $400,000. Enough to cover the exorbitant costs of her specialization, her residency fees, her board exams, and to set her up comfortably afterward. It was the key to the future. She felt so entitled to a future she believed she had earned all by herself. "That is the amount I want redirected," I said. There was no tremor in my voice. David met my gaze, his expression serious. "Are you absolutely sure, Bob, once we send this letter there's no going back? This will be a life-altering event for them. I thought of Diane's smiling face. I thought of her belief in the goodness of people and the nobility of medicine. And I thought of that dream being used to fund the lifestyle of a cruel, arrogant woman who used my shaking hands as a punchline. I am more sure of this than I have been of anything in the last 5 years, I replied. He nodded one last time. All right then. Let's draft the letter. Together we composed the message. It was a cold, impersonal document, a masterpiece of legal formality. It spoke of terms and conditions of articles and sections. It contained none of the raw human pain that had prompted its creation. It simply stated that pursuant to the terms outlined in the trust agreement, the Diane Vance Educational Trust was formally rescinding all current and future financial commitments to the beneficiary, Chloe Vance. The letter was addressed to the university's Board of Trustees and its financial aid office. We printed it on David's official letterhead. He signed it as the trust's financial manager, and I signed it as the benefactor. The ink was a dark, definitive slash on the page. It was done. All that was left was to put it in an envelope and let the quiet, implacable machinery of consequence begin to turn. I wasn't there to see it happen, of course. The letter David and I sent was a silent missile launched from his quiet downtown office and set to strike its target with calculated precision. We had timed it perfectly. But I can picture the scene as if I were a fly on the wall. I know my son's wife. I know her vanities, her ambitions, and her profound, unshakable belief in her own destiny. So it's easy for me to imagine her that night, a week after Christmas, sitting in the most expensive restaurant in the city. The kind of place with tasting menus that cost more than my first car, and lighting so dim it felt like a conspiracy. She would have been at the center of a round table surrounded by friends who reflected her own image back at her. All sharp angles, expensive clothes, and predatory smiles. The occasion was a celebration of her victory. She had just been matched with the most competitive plastic surgery residency program in the country. This was it, the culmination of her life's ambition. Not to heal, not to serve, but to attain a status so high, so wealthy, that no one could ever touch her. I can hear her voice, a confident, lilting thing, as she holds up her glass of champagne. It was a bloodbath, she would be saying, a theatrical sigh in her voice. Hundreds of applicants, and only 2 spots. But Dr. Albright, the head of the program, he told me my application was the most impressive he'd seen in a decade. Her friends would offer the appropriate chorus of oohs and ahs. They would talk about the money she was going to make, the celebrity clients she would have. They would plan trips on the yacht she hadn't yet bought. It was a fantasy, but for them it was already a reality. They were celebrating a future they believed was guaranteed. In the middle of a story about how she had charmed the board of directors during her interview, her phone would have buzzed on the table. A discreet, vibrating hum against the polished wood. She would have glanced down, her brow furrowing with annoyance at the interruption. The notification would be from her university email account, an address she associated only with triumphs and accolades. But the subject line would have been jarring, a piece of gravel in the smooth, creamy dessert of her evening. In stark official lettering, it would read, "Urgent funding issue for upcoming semester." For a normal person, a student whose entire future depended on that funding, such an email would be a lightning strike of pure panic. It would stop the conversation dead. It would send a cold spike of fear right through the heart. But Chloe was not a normal person. Chloe existed in a reality of her own, making a world where problems were for other people, where obstacles were merely administrative errors to be swatted away. I can see her face clearly in my mind's eye, the brief flash of irritation. The subtle roll of her eyes meant only for her closest friend to see. A small, dismissive smirk playing on her lips. An idiot in accounting, she would think. Some work-study student who probably filed the paperwork in the wrong place. She would deal with the annoyance tomorrow, with a sharp, imperious phone call that would put the little people in their place. She wouldn't open the email. She wouldn't give it that much power. Instead, she would press the button on the side of her phone silencing the screen, plunging the urgent message back into darkness. She would place the phone face down on the table, a definitive gesture of dismissal. The conversation, which had paused for only a second, would resume its self-congratulatory flow. She would pick up her champagne glass, the bad news already forgotten, banished from her perfect world. "Now where was I?" she'd say with a dazzling smile. "Ah, yes. Dr. Albright was just telling me about the summer rotation in Monaco." And she would raise her glass, her friends raising theirs in unison. A toast to Chloe, to her brilliant, flawless, and completely secure future. And as the glasses clinked together in that dim, expensive room, the sound would be a death knell, and she would be the only one in the world who couldn't hear it. The next morning, the storm I had engineered finally made landfall. I imagine Chloe woke up late nursing a champagne headache and basking in the glow of her own success. The email from the university would have been a distant, nagging thought, a piece of administrative lint to be brushed off her cashmere coat. I can picture her sitting at her minimalist white desk, a cup of expensive coffee in hand, dialing the bursar's office with an air of regal impatience. She would have used her most commanding voice, the one she reserved for service workers and people she considered beneath her. "Yes, hello," she would have snapped. "My name is Chloe Vance. I'm a fourth-year medical student. There seems to be some sort of clerical error regarding my funding. I received an email last night and I need it corrected immediately." There would have been a pause, the clicking of a keyboard on the other end. The person in that office, a faceless administrator of consequences, would have answered in a flat, bureaucratic monotone that no amount of Chloe's charm or anger could penetrate. "Yes, Ms. Vance, I have your file here. There is no error." I can see Chloe's perfectly sculpted eyebrows knitting together in confusion. "What do you mean there's no error?" "My tuition is paid for by the Diane Vance Educational Trust. It always has been." The voice on the other end would have remained maddeningly calm. "Ma'am, as of yesterday, the Diane Vance Educational Trust has formally rescinded all future funding commitments. Your account for the upcoming semester shows a balance due of $42,000. The silence that followed would have been exquisite. Chloe, for the first time in a long time, would be speechless. Then the sputtering rage. "That's impossible," she'd have hissed into the phone. "That's an irrevocable trust. You can't just rescind it. It's illegal." The administrator, unimpressed, would deliver the final impassive blow. "You will have to take that up with the executor of the trust, ma'am. I can give you his contact information if you like." The call would end. The sterile white walls of her perfect home would suddenly feel like they were closing in. Her first call, of course, would not be to David Chen. It would be to Michael. Not to ask for help, but to unleash her panic and fury, to demand that he fix it. And that is when my own phone began to ring. I had been waiting for the call, sitting in my quiet workshop, with a piece of unfinished leather in my hands. I saw Michael's name and I felt a profound, unshakable calm. The time for pain was over. It was now time for the accounting. I answered on the second ring. "Hello, Michael." He didn't bother with a greeting. His voice was a frantic, panicked squeak, worlds away from the cool, dismissive man who had called me on Christmas morning. "Dad." "What's going on? What did you do?" Chloe's school just called her. "They said Mom's fund is gone. They said the money is gone." I let his panic wash over me, a wave breaking against a stone wall. I took a slow breath before I answered, my voice quiet and measured. "It hasn't disappeared, Michael. It has been redirected." His confusion was palpable even through the phone. "Redirected? Redirected where?" "What are you talking about? That's Chloe's money. You can't just redirect her money." He said it with such conviction, such absolute, unthinking entitlement. He had repeated the lie to himself for so long that he now believed it as gospel. He believed they were owed this. They had earned it simply by existing. "No, son," I said, and the gentleness in my tone was sharper than any shout. "It was never her money. He started to protest, to bluster, but I continued my words, cutting through his panic like a surgeon's scalpel. It was your mother's dream. Your mother who worked double shifts at the library so we could start that first savings account. Your mother who believed that being a doctor was a sacred trust, a dream of supporting a compassionate, dedicated healer who would respect the dignity of every life. I paused, letting the words sink in, letting him remember the woman whose name he had so casually invoked. And then I delivered the final, devastating truth. It was not a dream meant to fund the future of someone who mocks a gift made with shaking hands and calls it cheap amateur work. Silence. For the first time, there was absolute, deafening silence on his end of the line. It was not the cowardly silence of Christmas night. It was the stunned, breathless silence of a man whose entire reality has just been dismantled before his very eyes. I could hear his mind working the frantic clicking as all the pieces fell into place. The gift, Chloe's cruel words, his own complicity, the phone call on Christmas morning. It was all connected. The world he had built for himself, a world of effortless comfort and unearned privilege, was built on a foundation he had never understood. And I had just pulled the cornerstone out. He finally managed to make a sound, a choked, strangled whisper. You knew. You heard her. I was there, Michael, I said softly. And you were there too. The weight of his own failure, his own betrayal was finally crashing down on him. But there was one last piece of the puzzle he was missing. One final blow to land. He probably thought I had somehow convinced a board or found a loophole. He still didn't understand the full scope of his miscalculation. She thought the money came from some anonymous family foundation, I said, my voice leaving no room for doubt. But there is no foundation, son. There is no board of directors. There was only ever me. I heard a sharp intake of breath, a sound that was half gasp, half sob. The anonymous benefactor. The source of all their good fortune. The man they had dismissed, ignored, and publicly humiliated. It was me. It was always me. The power they thought they had, the security they took for granted, it had all been in my hands the entire time, and they had been too arrogant and too blind to ever see it. I didn't need to say anything else. I had laid the truth bare. The rest was up to them. I could hear Chloe's frantic voice in the background, demanding to know what was happening. But Michael didn't answer her. He just made a quiet, broken sound. And then I ended the call. The confrontation was over. The silence that filled my workshop now was not one of emptiness, but of a terrible, final, and absolute justice. I hung up the phone. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel a thrill of victory. There was just a quiet, somber finality, the feeling an architect has when a condemned building is finally brought down. It is a necessary and logical conclusion, but there is no joy in the dust and wreckage. I wasn't there to see the immediate aftermath, of course, but I know what happens when a structure built on lies collapses. It is never a quiet process. I can imagine the scene in that cold, white house. Michael standing there with the phone still in his hand, his face pale and slack with shock. And Chloe, her eyes wide with a dawning animalistic panic. Her first reaction would not be remorse. It would be rage. A wild, lashing fury directed at the nearest target. "What do you mean?" he hung up, she would shriek, her voice stripped of all its practiced sweetness. "What did he say? Fix it?" "Michael, call him back. Tell him I'll apologize. Tell him whatever he wants to hear. You have to fix this." She would be grabbing at his arm, her carefully constructed world imploding around her. Michael, for the first time in their marriage, might have found a sliver of a backbone not from courage but from the sheer terror of his own ruin. He would have finally turned on her, his voice a choked whisper. "Fix it me. You're the one who did this. You're the one who called his gift cheap amateur work in front of everyone." The argument that followed would have been the realest conversation they had ever had. It would be a hurricane of blame and accusation. Her terror at losing her Beverly Hills dream would clash with his humiliation at being so thoroughly and completely outmaneuvered by the father he had underestimated his entire life. "You were supposed to handle him," she would scream. "He's your father. You let this happen, and he would have screamed back, and you're the one who couldn't pretend to be a decent human being for one night." One night, that's all it would have taken. The number would have echoed between them, a frantic, desperate mantra. $400,000. $400,000. The price of their arrogance. The cost of her cruelty. The foundation of their life together now revealed to be nothing but a debt they could never hope to pay. Their future, once a shining path of guaranteed success, was now a chasm of crippling student loans. And as they stood there, screaming at each other, in that perfect minimalist showroom, they would finally be forced to see the truth. They weren't a power couple. They were just two greedy strangers trapped in the rubble of a fallen house. A week later, I was back in my workshop. The familiar scent of leather and wood glue filled the air, a scent I had come to associate with peace. I ran my hand over a large, unblemished piece of hide, feeling its texture, its potential. I hadn't heard a word from Michael or Chloe, and I didn't expect to. Their silence was its own kind of admission. On a small laptop sitting on my workbench, an email notification pinged softly, a quiet chime in the stillness. It was from David. The subject line was simple: transfer complete. I opened it. There were no lengthy explanations, just a formal confirmation statement from the university's endowment fund. It confirmed that a sum of $402,000 had been successfully received from the Diane Vance Trust and used to establish a new permanent scholarship. I had chosen the name myself. It was now called the Diane Vance Memorial Scholarship for Compassionate Medicine. Its charter was specific. The scholarship was to be awarded each year to a medical student from a low-income background, a student who had demonstrated not just academic excellence, but a true and measurable gift for empathy and patient care. I read the words, and I felt none of the triumphant joy that comes with winning a fight. There was no surge of satisfaction, no pleasure in their downfall. Instead, a profound and gentle peace settled over me, the kind of quiet that comes after a long and necessary storm. I had not acted out of revenge. I had acted as a guardian. I had protected my wife's beautiful dream from being twisted into a tool for arrogance and greed. The true payoff was not in taking the money from Chloe. It was in giving it to the kind of person Diane would have championed. A young aspiring doctor somewhere who would see that money not as an entitlement, but as a lifeline, a miracle. A person whose hands, steady or not, would be used to heal, to comfort, to serve. That was Diane's real legacy. And now it was safe. My own hands were resting on the workbench. The tremor was still there, a quiet, constant rhythm. It would always be a part of me. But Chloe's words had lost their sting. She had tried to define me by my perceived weakness, by the unsteadiness of my hands. But she was wrong. My worth was never in the perfection of my craft. It was in the intention behind it. I picked up my knife, its blade sharp and clean. I laid it against the new piece of leather, and with a slow, deliberate movement, I made the first cut. My hand trembled, but the line was true. This experience taught me a difficult but necessary lesson. True value is not measured by a price tag, but by the love and intention behind an act. For too long, I allowed my financial support to be mistaken for my silence, letting my wife's legacy of compassion be used to fuel arrogance. I learned that real strength isn't found in endlessly enduring disrespect, but in calmly defending your principles. Withdrawing the fund wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of profound respect for my wife's memory, ensuring her dream would nurture kindness, not cruelty. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and please like and subscribe if you believe that true worth should always be respected.